I'm not really interested in what's popular. I want to make the music artistically that I want to make, that I can be proud of in 5 years' time or 10 years' time.
Dance Music Secrets with Kevin Mackay.
Welcome to Dance Music Secrets. Today's guest is Scott Diaz. Scott is a DJ, producer, label owner, sound designer from Brighton. Throughout his career, Scott has maintained an unwavering focus on underground, house and garage. While others have wavered and adapted their sound to suit the mainstream, Scott has stayed true to his roots. As his career developed, he's picked up top-tier labels like Defected and A-list DJs like Honey Dijon and Fred Again. Welcome to Dance Music Secrets, Scott Diaz.
Thanks for having me, and nice intro. Appreciate it.
Today we're going to discuss Scott's background, how he started out as a DJ with no musical experience, and what has led him to having one of the hottest IDs on the planet right now. His remix of Gabrielle is being caned by the likes of Honey Dijon and Enzo Zaragoza. Let's go right back to the beginning, Scott. Tell us about that first thing that made you start DJing, the first thing that where you picked up that bug.
Well, the first thing that got me into sort of electronic music overall was I can remember it. I've talked about it before, but it's a pivotal moment for me if I look back at it now. And that was a time when I was at school. I borrowed a Dreamscape 11 tape. So I don't know if you remember those.
Yeah.
It was pretty much the biggest kind of rave of its era. My friend, his name was Ricky Rutherford. He had an older brother, I think, or sister that used to go to some of these raves. And so, as was often the way, whether it was pirate radio or whatever, tape packs, you would have older brothers and sisters that were going out to things that would often have them around the house, and the younger brothers or sisters would pick them up. And anyway, he lent me this tape. It was a Dreamscape 11 tape. It was DJ Psy on one side, LSD on the other side. And it was kind of like a mix of sort of what I would describe as like hardcore jungle. So it was kind of like jungle elements, kind of breaks, big heavy basses, but also the kind of happy hardcore type elements of like, pianos and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, this tape was just life-changing for me. It sort of just allowed me this glimpse into this world and this whole sort of subculture that I just became really, really interested in. And then I started to figure out that there were record shops around this, there were labels, there were other artists, and there was essentially this whole sort of community and ecosystem. And I just sort of delved more and more and more into that. I started going out to a lot of like, illegal parties and stuff in fields around in Uckfield and sort of places surrounding Brighton. Also went out to a few things at the Sanctuary and a few things when I was underage. You couldn't get into everything, but certain things I'd get into. And all of this was while I was still at school. I actually borrowed that tape when I was 12. It was 1994.
Right,
but I didn't start going out until maybe I was 15. But by then I was kind of buying records. But they were like hardcore records, or there was like I think one or two people at school that had decks at the time, so everyone would just kind of go around there, or they would be the one that everyone would put pressure on to kind of borrow the decks for the party that was happening that weekend.
Right. Okay.
And so I was kind of like getting my sort of head around DJing in a sort of ramshackle way. But that was kind of the impetus, that moment, and then from then on, it kind of spiraled into like being into other genres, moving more into being into jungle and drum and bass and stuff like that. That was the moment that I can pinpoint that it sort of changed for me.
And then how did you develop your early style, and when did you actually start DJing? So was it at those early house parties, like and then because you're known for house and garage, so when did that sort of transition occur? And tell us a bit about that.
So I started buying kind of probably jungle and drum and bass records when I was like 16. I went to a shop in Brighton called HVR, Happy Vibes Recordings. It was also a record label. You can go on Discogs and still check out the label. And there was a guy in there called Martin, who is the DJ Crafty Cuts. He was doing fairly well then. Not, he's obviously massive now, but he owned that record shop at the time. And there was a few other kind of local legend type DJs that worked in there, as is often the way with those places. And I started going in there, didn't really know anything about kind of, jungle drum and bass at the time, other than the kind of hardcore bits and pieces that maybe crossed over a bit. And I went in there a couple of times. I went in there on this one particular day. I met another group of people in there, and I asked about a particular record. And before anyone behind the counter could answer, this kid who's a year younger than me answered and just said, "You won't be able to get that record." He was like, and he ended up becoming one of my best friends, still one of my best friends now. He's got this encyclopedic knowledge of like jungle and drum and bass.
Wow.
And so anyway, we all just became firm friends. We left the record shop, went and got a McDonald's, as you do, with your records, ready to go home and have a mix. And then after that, we kind of just, it went step by step for all of us. I think we all had the same thing in mind. I think it happens with a lot of people. You get into one aspect of what you love, which is playing music, and then you sort of want to start tacking on all the other things afterwards.
Yeah.
So it's like then wanting to play your own music becomes a next natural progression.
Yeah.
Then you want to release your own music and have, then you want to put on your own party, and so like it becomes this sort of 360 thing. And so we just completely immersed ourselves in all of that. We would go out to Hastings Pier, to Atomics. We would travel to Astoria, go to things, Heaven in London, go to all the jungle and raves and stuff there. We were putting on parties in Brighton at like the Concord, at the what was called the Escape then, which is now Patterns, with audio a few years ago. We did stuff at the Ocean Rooms, like all of that. And we were going up to Music House, cutting dubs and all of that. So we were fully in the kind of like jungle drum and bass thing, even though we were really, really young. We were booking like Mickey Finn, Nicky Black Market, all of that. So at this point, it was very much firmly like jungle drum and bass. But at the same time, I was kind of buying a few garage tunes as well, which was funny because it was like in our friendship group, it was sort of like, sort of seen as, I don't know, I was being a bit of a traitor in a way.
Really?
Do you know what I mean? Not in a friendly way. It was never like a serious problem, but they were sort of like, oh, Scott's buying a few of these garage records. And I
was wondering, just when you mentioned Music House, and a lot of people won't know it, so just off the Caledonian Road in London, there used to be this place where it was like a small mastering studio, but you could cut acetate. So I used to, when I got sent early productions by people I was friendly with at the time, Deep Dish, people like that, I would go and be able to cut a 10-inch and you'd be able to go and play that in clubs and stuff. But was there no, and you would go in and it was very much like drum and bass culture, jungle culture.
Yeah.
Was there any garage getting cut there at that time?
Yeah, there was quite a lot of garage. I cut a couple of my early sort of garage attempts there when a little bit later on when I was like 18 or 19. I was also using Transition and JTS a little bit as well.
Right. Okay.
And, Transition had a thing where you could send it off to them in the mail and they would post it back to you.
Oh wow,
so
that's cool.
So for people that didn't live in London, that was handy. But yeah, in terms of Music House, that was the original place, and that was the kind of place that was really deep in the culture.
Yeah.
But it was quite intimidating to go there as a young person. Yeah, like being not from London and going there was like mad because you would just rock up and there'd be like Groove Rider there and all these people that are just like, and you're kind of there with these records that you've made that you just know are like, pretty average or not that great compared to the stuff that they're cutting. And of course, they would all be swapping stuff. Other than DJ over there, I'll give you a copy of that. You have a copy of that. And it's in a way, it's like it's funny. I talk a lot about hierarchy, about this thing of like there's no hierarchy now, and so it's good in a way because you can just to have instant access to the people that you want to reach and your favorite DJs or DJs you think can help you or labels or whatever. It's great to have that because you don't want to gatekeep and be like, well, you're not established enough yet or important enough to talk to me or any of that sort of stuff. But the hierarchy has disappeared. So what that means is the sort of level of like, the level of respect in terms of, I wouldn't have dreamed of just going to Music House and just being like, I'm next in queue. I'm going to cut. If Groove Rider came in and he was wanting to cut an album, he would go in front of you and you would have to wait.
Really? I remember it being very intimidating because I'm coming down from Glasgow and I wasn't living in London and I'm just this really tall Scottish guy completely out of place.
Fish out of water, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's no other, like, I'm the only white person there when I go, and I'm the only Scottish person, so I do feel like, but yeah, I never had that, I never saw that there, but maybe I just didn't know who some of the people were.
Sure, and also maybe you didn't go there enough, I don't know, but I would go there quite regularly.
Right, okay.
With me and my friends, it would be a case of, if there were DJs there who were higher in the food chain than you were,
right, okay,
they would go in front of you and you would wait.
Right, interesting.
And it's as simple as that. And you wouldn't say anything. You just wait your turn. And that's what I mean about hierarchy. It's like that thing of just going, you kind of like earning your place, and then actually sometimes what would happen is if there was someone around while you were cutting your track, you might get one of those DJs ask you if they can cut a copy because they might have a side spare or something. So, it was good for that community aspect of meeting people. I met lots of people up there, you know.
Right, okay.
I ended up meeting a lot of garage people because I went there more when I was cutting my own stuff. When I was going before that, I was going with friends who were cutting their drum and bass and jungle stuff, and I wasn't
Yeah.
really producing much then. But there was this definite hierarchy, and you know, same as a record shop kind of has that as well, and it represents like another kind of facet of the community element that kind of makes up what it is that we do. But so it's a shame that that's been lost in a way. But it was a you know, it was a magic place for that. I don't, you know, I wouldn't change that.
It's very true. It's an interesting part of the culture. I definitely remember it from record stores. But anyway, let's go back. I interrupted your story about cutting dub plates and going up to and the journey from jungle into garage. So
Yeah,
let's get back to that.
yeah. So at the time, so what was happening was I was starting to buy more and more garage records, and at the time it was like very much sort of what I describe as London underground two-step, you know.
Right, okay.
So it hadn't gone commercial at this point, and speed garage had kind of come and gone. You know, the Rip Groove thing had happened. There was still a few people in '98 making speed garagey kind of remixes. Maybe
Yeah.
RIP was still doing stuff. 187 Lockdown, you know, I think was released in '98, maybe it might
Right,
have been
okay.
slightly early, but
Like
anyway.
the whole Armin van Helden Spin Spin Sugar thing, that all played out.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny because I've actually been putting together a speed garage mix. Like I do this thing called Other Side mixes, which is where I play a different style, and I've been trying to put together a speed garage mix, and it's quite interesting to try and get variation of the older stuff. There's obviously quite a bit of new stuff now you can get, but trying to go back and get the older stuff, it was basically only RIP and 187 Lockdown who were pretty much doing every single remix. 'Cause there wasn't that many people doing it, but it didn't last that long. So anyway, I was kind of playing this London Underground two-step stuff, and I was buying from my local record shop in Brighton, which was called Urban Records. It's run by a guy called Mick Fuller, who is kind of like, you know, a sort of an icon of sort of Brighton music. Kind of bought a lot of, you know, would book like, you know, Joey Negro and all these kind of people to play down in Brighton, but also brought MJ Cole down for the first time and did a lot of the garage artists and stuff. And he started a night called New Garage Central, which was one of the first weekly garage nights in the UK. And because I've been going in the shop at this point, maybe a year or two, and buying records and stuff, and I was also going to London a lot to cut dubs and also shop in London for records, because a lot of stuff didn't even make it down to Brighton because it would just sell out in London and need for it to be distributed elsewhere, you know. And so he kind of said to me, well, look, you know, I know you've been buying a lot of this garage, and I would like to, you know, maybe have you come and do this sort of student pre-bar thing for me and do a couple of weeks there, and if you do well, I've got this garage night, you know, and I'd like to make you a resident. And this would, you know, would have been at the Escape Weekly. So I just turned 18, not long turned 18 basically, and I had a residency at that night.
Amazing.
And it ended up getting voted one of the top 10 nights in the UK by Mixmag and Seven magazine in like 2000, 2001. So it was a pretty big deal. We had literally everyone down there every single week. It would be like, you know, MJ Cole, next week Matt Jallamont, next week you'd have like, you know, Norris, the boss.
Yeah.
But you'd also have a lot of the London Underground pirate DJs. So like Jazzy D and like, you know, Hermit and sort of Daryl B and people that were kind of like underground soldiers, as it were, that were playing on big pirate stations in London, but weren't kind of as big as the, you know, the other guys. So so that was good. So I got to meet and play with a lot of, you know, people then whose records I was playing, and then it kind of just, you know, spiraled from there. I ended up doing like playing in Greece, playing in Ibiza, like playing garage at the time. It was obviously going very, very commercial by that point.
Yeah.
And at the time that was happening as well, I was also starting to really buy a lot of the sort of US garage stuff that I'd missed, because the shop that I was shopping in, Urban Records, was really a house shop.
Right.
You know, mostly it was like US house and soulful house and stuff like that, funky house, all that kind of stuff. You know, the French bits that were around kind of 2000 time. And so I was kind of buying a lot of the stuff that I had missed that I wasn't really old enough for. You know,
stuff that came out like 93, 4,
exactly,
5.
all the early Masters at Work, Mood to Swing, all the New York stuff, New Jersey
things that,
stuff.
you know, those Masters at Work records, which people cite as kind of UKG classics, or part of what formed that early, you know, influenced Grant Nelson when he's starting Nice and Ripe, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly that. I was going back and buying all of that because Mick, you know, was kind of putting you know, saying get your head around this, because, you know, if you don't want to kind of keep playing this garage thing forever, or you think it's going to go somewhere that you don't necessarily feel that great playing it, because it was kind of getting like the music was getting a bit darker.
Well, there was two strands. There was Daniel Bedingfield on one half, and then there's like Oxide and Neutrino coming through on the other.
Yeah, and there's the sort of whole, you know, I was much more, the soulful stuff was much more me, and I was essentially playing mostly two-step at the time. There wasn't really a lot of 4/4
Kelly
stuff
G,
around.
stuff like that.
Yeah, but I was playing like Wide Boys, Sovereign, Sunship,
Yeah.
MJ Cole, you know, obviously Dem 2, that kind of thing. But it started to go obviously a lot darker, and I didn't mind some of that stuff for a while because it kind of played into my drum and bass and jungle sensibilities.
Yeah, there was a sort
And
of Reese element that came
yeah,
through in the early
and
stuff as it was starting to go darker.
I liked like Zed Bias as well.
Yeah.
You know, those kind of producers were like kind of doing it well because it was still like Wookie. You know, if you listen to Wookie's music, it's dark, but it's not dark.
Yeah.
There's in something. I was actually just talking to him. I was at a party with him about 2 weeks ago, and I was having that exact conversation with him, saying it was always something kind of moody and dark about your music, but also not dark, kind of uplifting. And he really straddled that line so well, you know. And so as it started to get more and more like that, I kind of went, well, I'm going to kind of start buying more and more of these other records so I can maybe play that. As it happened, that's not really the way it went. I ended up kind of staying with the garage thing when it all kind of died down. And then there was like a few of us kind of making this, what was termed like new school garage at the time, which was like this little era between like 2004 and, you know, 2007 or 8. There was, you know, MJ Cole was doing his Prolific Club Night at Herbal.
So in between, after the kind of like what happened with Oxide and Neutrino, there was like there was gun violence. Garage became like a dirty word.
Yeah.
And then before, like it became trendy. So records like Backs by Mosca, which were much more like on sort of cool labels rather than coming from kind of garage labels. They were on labels that were doing just whatever was cool.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Exactly. And then so that period there, that sort of. Because after that, you had obviously all the UK funky things started to happen, dubstep, you know, which obviously had sort of already been bubbling around because of Forward and all this stuff, Croydon in the sort of mid 2000s. That, you know, that Artwork EP on Big Apple with the track Red, you know, it's kind of like proto dubstep sort of records were like, but they were there in sort of 2003, 4. And garage, I would say, pretty much the cutoff for like what we sort of think of as, you know, two-step classic sort of two-step garage. Like was pretty much 2003.
Right.
MJ Cole's album, I think, Cut to the Chase, came out in 2003, and there was a few remixes that like Matt Jam was doing, Walking Around, like Andy Gill, like a few of just I remember from memory a few of those things, and it was like 2002, 2003, and that was it. It was like a hard line, it seemed, and then it moved on to something else.
And when we were talking before today, I thought what was really interesting that at that time, and I said this in the introduction, a lot of people would have morphed at that point. I've seen it before where something dies, like the great deep house crash of 2002, and myself included, we went off and did something else. I went on and worked with Milo, but you didn't. You stuck with that garage thing, and you were telling me about the different jobs you had to work. And so what, you know, tell us a bit about that time, because that's, you're in something that is not popular, and you're just you're stuck. You've stuck to it. So what's the?
I don't know. I haven't really thought. I think I'm just thinking this out loud now. So like, it might not be the most coherent way of putting it, but because I'm just thinking it. I'm thinking it through as you're asking the question. But if I look back at it now, it seems to me that given in terms of DJing, I wasn't really doing a lot at that point. My residency had finished. I'd moved out of Brighton. I was living in Hertfordshire. I'd met a girl at the time who lived in like Harpenden, Hemel, St Albans area, just outside London. And I basically moved up there, and I moved out of Brighton because nothing was really happening. So I was wanting to get into making music, and I had some basic equipment, and I made some friends with some people in a record shop, and they had a studio downstairs, and I rented that studio space.
Yeah.
And I put some stuff in there, and I was making some music, which meant I could make music 24 hours a day, but I did need to work a normal job. And I was working in a call center doing like car finance, like customer service, right, on the phone. And to answer your question about sort of sticking around with that music, it was almost like I'd moved to a new area, so that the contacts I had were only within that music. I also wasn't very good at making music at that point.
Right.
So if I tried to jump to another genre and then tried to make music in that genre, I would have probably been even more ill-prepared and worse at it than I would have been at making kind of early attempts at garage in like the mid-2000s, you know. So maybe it was a safety thing of like just keeping myself around something that I was already quite familiar with, and that I could maybe excel in a bit quicker it's almost like that thing of you get all these singers that want to be British R&B singers, and a lot of them I say you're pretty good singer, but there's lots of other R&B singers that are really good, better than
Yeah.
you. But you could be a really great house vocalist
Yeah.
or a really great garage vocalist. So you should consider doing something that's in a smaller world that gets you noticed more, and then maybe that can translate into you then doing the thing that you want. You know, you
Yeah.
start off doing dance music, and then you kind of get to do the thing you want. Maybe it's almost like, you know, that can be. I mean, how many times have you seen it happen where someone producer or an artist works with a singer or a vocalist on a dance record or whatever that isn't necessarily their first choice of style, but
Yeah.
that helps them blow up, and then it maybe helps them get an album deal, or they
But-
get, you know, and then it potentially leads to this whole career for them that they didn't necessarily think that they would have. So maybe I think for me there was maybe some safety in that,
Yeah.
and kind of just trying to learn my trade in a small pond, basically, you know, and trying to get established in that smaller pond before jumping into something else.
But you still had the passion for it. So what, even though I get that might have been a safety thing, and that totally makes sense to me, but you still, despite that, you had a passion for something that was kind of unpopular, for want of a better
Yeah.
word, and you stuck with it. So that
Yeah.
there's a sort of grit and determination there, which is you've got to look back on with some pride.
Yeah, I think as well, for me, it's about the intention. The intention is what's important in terms of, you know, if I'm not saying that people who switch, I don't know, musical allegiances is not really the right term,
Yeah.
but people who switch, you know, for the purposes of their career and maybe the business aspect benefit of it, or some benefit to it in terms of the market that's available or their opportunities or whatever. I think I can understand that more when someone's already quite established, because
Yeah.
they've already got, you know, a network, probably quite a strong skill set across being, you know, just producing generally, not having to, it doesn't have to be about producing one type of record.
Yeah.
Whereas I didn't really have that.
Yeah.
So for me to just go, well, I'm going to be interested in another style of music because it's more popular at the moment, doesn't seem to me to be it seems quite cynical.
Yeah.
And I sort of felt like I would have been doing that based on not really having necessarily any real talent at that point to jump to something else and feel like I really deserve to be a part of that. It's almost like having to earn what you've got. And now if something happened and I went, I'm going to make that style, or I'm going to sort of pivot a bit, it feels like it would be done from a more of a position of I've kind of given more, because I've got lots of music out there that's different style. And so it wouldn't be some massive departure. It would just be a slight tweak here, or, you know, it's like if you make a record at 130 BPM, it's a garage record. If you make a record at 122, the same tune, it might be a deep house record. Sometimes
true.
it's just
That is very true.
just a smaller thing as that, and then maybe making a couple of tiny different choices in terms of sound.
Yeah, completely.
You know, decisions or whatever.
We had a
So I think, yeah, for me, it's the intention's always been about what's important. I'm not really interested in what's popular. I really couldn't care less what's popular. I want to do what I want to do, and I want to make the music artistically that I want to make, that I can be proud of in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. That's what I'm aiming for. Every single thing that I make, I want someone to be playing it in 5 years' time. And I'm not saying I always hit that. You know, we don't always hit that. All of us miss that. But if the intention is there to try and hit that, then that to me is the pure thing. And then whatever happens after that, and wherever the record goes, when it goes out into the world and it doesn't really belong to you anymore, it kind of becomes its own thing, you know. And and I'm okay with that.
Cool. I think it's a very considered opinion. Most people don't have that. Some people might end up at that. Like I've started at that and wavered and then gone back to it. But it's to have that throughout your career I think is a great thing to have done. But anyway, let's go. So we've talked a lot about how you developed as a DJ, but let's get into how you developed as a musician, as a producer, because I listen to some of your music now, and the musicality is incredible. You know, I love the sound. Everything about your records, from the beats to the sound design to the musical content, is top drawer. You know, and considering you started at 18 as a DJ, or 15 as a DJ, whenever you want to say, with no musical knowledge, I think for someone to get that and still have to live their life, you know, is incredible. A lot of people who end up making great records at 18, 19 have been learning piano for like 7, 8, 9 years. And so they come to this idea of making music with a whole bunch of knowledge, whereas you came to it with a bunch of desire, but not much knowledge. So tell us
I also wasn't making any great records at 18.
Yeah, but you have to. Yeah. So anyway, you tell us about it. I've got my theories about it. You tell us about it. You tell us about the journey and what was important and what got you from A to B.
in terms of learning, in terms of making music, that was the first thing. It was like just you know, trying to learn your way around, you know, around a studio, which at the time it was more when I was first making music at 18. The friends I met in the record shop, we were all working, but obviously only earning little bits of money. And
Yeah.
I think the first job I ever had at 18, at 16, my first full-time job was at a hotel, and I was earning like £3.34 an hour, and I was living at home and paying rent to my parents as well. So with what I had left, I was buying records, and we were all chipping in to buy studio equipment.
Yeah.
So we would all kind of like get together and go, right, there's this effects unit, it's 150 quid, and we'd all put in, five of us would put in 30 quid each or whatever, and we would have.
And you'd have a shared
Yeah, and we'd
studio.
have a shared studio because it was
Great.
like a collective.
It was expensive.
We
to
had
do.
like a little crew. We were a crew, and that's
Yeah.
how we did everything. And so that was sort of how it all started. And we would just we would just sit in that room basically, just trying to learn how to make music. And we got some help from other people, like the guys in Martin in the record shop, Crafty Cuts, and they upstairs, Ed Solo, and Ed Solo had a studio up there. Click and Cycle, who's working with a promoter called Dave Stone. There was a few other. I used to go around and play Ed Solo my records on cassette, and he was always really gracious with me, and they were like crap, but he was always just like, yeah, and gave me feedback, and I'm still really good friends with him to this day. But so you get help from people like that, and you kind of lean on people, and you sort of go into record shops and try and get them to play the stuff, people that you sort of respect that are selling tunes and all that, all that sort of stuff. And I was doing that for a while and sort of cutting some dubs and off of the, getting kind of brave enough and confident enough to go, maybe I can show this to the world now, and then when I moved out of Brighton, I'd had like a basic, like a Mac G3 at the time. I suppose it wasn't that basic at the time, but I had that, and it had Logic on it. And I remember I bought it. I think I bought it on eBay or something, and it had Logic on it, kind of pre-installed, which was like a big part of the reason I bought it. That was before it was actually eMagic. If you remember eMagic, before they purchased it, and it went Mac only. But yeah, so that was that, and I had it in that studio below the record shop in St Albans, and because I was just working, I didn't really, have much of a life in terms of I didn't really know many people, because I'd not long moved, and I was kind of just doing everything I was doing was around music basically.
Right. Okay.
So I was playing on. I had a show on Freeze for a while, Freeze FM. I had a friend called Bacon who was kind of like quite pivotal in terms of introducing me to a few people. And I can't drive. I never learned to drive.
Right. Okay.
Part of living in Brighton and then part of living abroad and things like that. I've just never gotten around to it. I am going to have to get around to it. But anyway, so he would just come and pick me up, and we'd like drive into London, and we'd go and see Matt Jam play in the West End, or we'd go to all these garage parties. He used to play at Liberty, which was used to be at Coliseum, but it moved to Vauxhall. And so we would go to that all the time. And so other than that, I was just in this studio just trying to make music, and I'd have kind of MCs sometimes come through and we'd do stuff, or people would come in and record vocals, so you'd meet people through that. And it was kind of like all a little bit ramshackle, but I was probably about 23 or something at the time, so I was kind of still making my way. And yeah, just sort of dedicating myself to it every day. Basically, I didn't have any piano lessons until I was 21.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was that I just reached a point where I just got frustrated, and I was listening to other people's music, and I grew up in quite extreme poverty, and so we barely even had food in the cupboards. I mean, lots of nights I'd still be indoors with my sister, younger sister, just sitting there waiting for my parents to come back so we could have some dinner, like something to eat, like beans on toast or whatever, So like the idea of being able to learn an instrument or do anything like that was just never on the cards. And so even though I was kind of interested in music at school, I never pushed anything like that, and never really made a big deal of it, because I just knew it would never have been possible for my parents to do that.
Yeah.
I never wanted to kind of, I guess I kind of had an acute awareness of that would put pressure on them or make them feel a certain way or whatever. And maybe there would have been help to, help me learn and whatever, but it's not something I ever explored anyway. But I just kind of got to a point listening to other people's music where I was just like, there's a glass ceiling to what I'm going to be able to achieve unless I learn actually about music and what I'm doing here, and use that to kind of accelerate my musical kind of, my productions basically. So I found a piano teacher that taught jazz piano, and I said to her that I didn't want to do the traditional grades. There's 5 grades for jazz, there's 8
Yeah,
grades
yeah.
for classical, and would she be able to sort of work with me, probably against her better instinct, because most of them just want to do the, like, no, you have to go through all these stages
Yeah.
and learn these, but because I already knew quite a lot of the scales, and things like sometimes when you go for your first music lesson, it's like, where's, you can't even, the teacher's like, I'm going to teach you where middle C is today, like that's
Yeah,
what you're
yeah.
going to learn. But I already knew quite a bit of that stuff, so I was like, can you just teach me how I can practically apply these things? I'll still do the normal lessons and the normal techniques and exercises and stuff, but can we have this in mind, that this is my goal, to be able to actually practically apply this in a way that isn't going to take me years and years to be able to do my first proper chord progression or whatever.
Yeah,
So
I think that's
she was
really,
good with that.
I
Yeah.
think that's really important for people who are wanting to be producers or wanting to get into making music, that they do find someone to help them. If they don't have musical experience, if they didn't do that, to find someone that will help them, teach them the music that they need to know.
Yeah.
Like when I moved to London, I'm the same person that taught Jamie Jones taught me, a great guy called Danny Cooperberg in Kirchend, and it was the same thing. It was like, how do I make records that sound like this?
Yeah. There's a temptation, I think, for there's a temptation with making music, but with creativity in general, that it's where the sort of idea, or that people feel the need to just have to learn everything. It's like, I've got, there's a course on like Photoshop or something, and it's like they feel they have to learn every single thing about Photoshop, and it's like, why don't you just learn the things that are going to help you solve the problems that you've got right now, so you can get this thing done and sort of ship the work and get it out, and then you can figure out solving the next problem when you come, crossing that bridge when you come to it creatively. And so I think there's a big thing around that creative people kind of want to know everything, want to be able to solve every problem.
Yeah.
But you don't need every tool available to you in the toolbox at that moment. You just need the ones that help you solve the problem that you've got.
Completely.
And so I think that's a big thing, because otherwise getting bogged down in all of that, which I think is what you're alluding to, it's like, if you learn everything, then your head just becomes filled with lots of things that aren't useful at the moment, and the way that you're, the way that your brain is going to work against you in those situations is that the things that you actually need are maybe not going to be as readily available for you to just solve the problem, and it's also going to result in you getting less actual work done, which is the thing you want to get done, because you can't do anything with unfinished work. It's no good having like 2 unfinished records. You might as well have 1 finished record, because you can actually do something with that. You can play it to someone, or it can be released. You can put it up for free, whatever. So I think that's a big part of it as well.
Absolutely true. I mean, most piano teachers are just going to want you to do a lot of exercises to get your fingers moving, to be able to play to use your hands independently, and that's great when it comes to composing later on, because you're able to sort of move between chords quickly and think and sort of work with different ideas. But I've only started doing that recently, and I've made like thousands of records.
Yeah.
Well, not thousands, over 1,000 records, and
Yeah.
I did loads of them without being able to do it. So, just learn what you need to know to get the next thing done, to get to that next level. So I think it's great, and great that you did that. But what I'd want to do now is go to the next point, which I think is probably quite pivotal in your life, is when you got introduced to Matt Jam Lamont. And for people watching, maybe just we'll talk a bit about Tough Jam and the origins of like UK garage and how important Matt is to that, and then just talk about how you met him and what kind of influence he had on your career.
Yeah, I mean, I'd been listening to Matt's records or Tough Jam's records and stuff, and like going to see them play before I knew Matt. Before I'd even moved to London, I was going to went to certain garage raves and stuff at Glass House and things like that. And Matt and Carl would be playing there, and at the time I met Matt, obviously him and Carl weren't working together anymore. They'd split up in like 2001 or 2 or something.
Right.
And he was working with Gavin Mills, who actually engineered most of the Tough Jam records.
Oh, right, okay.
So that most of the Tough Jam records, especially remixes and stuff like that, were engineered by Gavin Mills, who was part of copyright, you know, and all of that.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I mean, he engineered like the Dream Team, the theme. He was a great engineer, working mostly in the garage scene, but doing a lot of earlier rave stuff as well. And then obviously went on to do Mystique Y with Matt, and then obviously copyright, which was massive. They're obviously on Defected. Now he's a photographer.
Right.
He's
Okay.
pretty much given up doing music. So he's done like press shots for me, Matt, Sunny Federa, most of the people on Defected. Does text photos at Glitterbox, and
Right.
he's an
Okay.
amazing. I mean, he's maybe even better at being a photographer than he was at making music. And he was
Well,
amazing
that's
at
saying
making
something.
music. So yeah, you can check his stuff out. But yeah, so I was obviously following Matt's music, and I had a bunch of Tough Jam stuff and records and whatnot. And yeah, as I say, at the time I was living in Hertfordshire, and I had this friend called Bacon, and he was a DJ, but he was also like just a kind of PR guy before there was really social media. He was kind of like on the MySpace thing and on the early Facebook thing, and event invites and kind of posting up about the event and how great it was, and kind of like doing his PR thing. And part of what he did was connected people with other people. So if if there was a DJ that wanted to play somewhere, or they wanted to meet a certain promoter, or this producer wanted to meet this DJ or whatever, he would kind of make it happen, and he'd put you in touch with people, or he'd take you out to a party where that person was playing, and then he'd introduce you. And so he was kind of like a facilitator for that kind of for the garage scene. And there was this interesting mix of, as I alluded to earlier, when there was this kind of like period that it was in the doldrums. What was happening was there was still garage parties happening, but it was all old school stuff. It was basically just kind of like Pied Piper, Norris the Boss, Matt Jam, and all these people just playing the hits. Essentially, it's sort of a lot of it then had become almost like it become like a heritage scene.
Yeah.
You'd get kind of those DJs playing with like Alison Limerick doing Where Love Lives. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It become like a heritage scene really in that sense. But there was also still people making music, new music. So MJ Cole was doing new stuff. I was doing stuff. That Huxley was making music in that
Yeah,
scene
yeah.
under another name. He was called Des Jones at the time.
All right.
He was
Okay.
making kind of like bassliney sort of up north, the niche sort of Sheffield stuff that kind of became popular for a bit. Tourist was there making music under the name Will Phillips. I was doing stuff. You had like Delinquent, and there was a whole bunch of other people, some of whom are still doing bits and pieces now, but probably me, Huxley, Tourist, are probably the three kind of biggest that would that have kind of sustained careers.
Yeah.
But were doing things then. So there was some talent there, but it was just kind of incubating. And it's interesting that all of us kind of found this, because we obviously all loved garage, but we obviously found a home in this place where it was like you could kind of make music without it being a massive risk, and you could kind of hone your craft kind of under the radar.
I think it's great. It's a great time when that happens, because no one's looking at you. You've got a crew of people that are all supporting you, so you've got feedback.
Yeah.
But you don't have this. You could be putting records out, but because they're being largely ignored because it's not in fashion,
Yeah.
you kind of like your levels of success are so much different, and
Yeah.
what means success to you is so
Yeah.
much different, and just allows you to be creative.
There was still people putting records out, like vinyl as well.
Yeah.
There was still like a guy called Charmer. He used to play. He had a show on pirate radio, and he would press up records at like 3 or 4 labels. He was putting MJ Cole stuff out on Prolific. MJ Cole was running his Prolific label still. He was doing his Prolific club night once a month, which he was kind of bringing us lot into play and warm up and stuff.
Great.
And it was like, so once a month you get to go and hang out with everyone. It's almost like an industry social. And MJ Cole would be there, and like Wiki would pop down. You get to have conversations with these people. So even though there wasn't really a garage scene to speak of in any healthy way,
Yeah.
there was one where you still had contact with these people that were like idols to you. And so there was kind of that sort of thing happening. The reason I mention that is because when there was when there was an opportunity for Bacon, my friend Bacon, to give some of my music to a couple of people, he basically burned a couple of CDs of stuff I'd given him. And it was just like remixes, like bootleg of like The Boy Is Mine and just random stuff like that. I think I'd done a couple of mixes of MJ Cole tracks as well, because he'd put the parts out for all of us to remix, things he'd done, trying to get the community involved and whatever. And so he gave this CD to Matt Jam anyway. And Matt ended up playing like 7 of them on one of his shows on Kiss, because he had a show on Kiss
amazing.
at the time. And so, yeah, there was like 7 of the tracks on Kiss that he played. And then he kind of used to have every year he would do his like picks, these are my 3 picks for the year, these are the guys to watch. And there was me and Delinquent, and I think a guy called Artifact, who was like a Russian producer, that he said at that time. And then afterwards I said to him, phoned him and said, thanks so much for all the support on the radio, etc. And then he said to me, look, I don't know what you've got going on musically, but I've got a studio, at my place. And if you want to maybe start doing some stuff together, we should see if it can go anywhere. So he was living in like Winchmore Hill at the time in London, in a massive house that he just lived in by himself. And he had a studio in the loft. So I was like going over there the weekends or whatever, and, then I'd go to gigs with him as well. And we just go back, we'd make stuff in the studio. We had a couple of vinyl releases that we put out. But again, it was like an interesting time because he was so well established and had such a great career and was kind of doing all of these things. And I was sort of essentially really nowhere still, other than in this very small niche scene of, a few hundred people that knew me. But I think that it was interesting working with him because he exposed me to a lot of music and going out and seeing him play a lot of different types of gigs gave me a good insight into how he would sort of adapt what he's playing, and obviously he'd been DJing for so long that he just had this great kind of instinct for it. And so it was good from that perspective. And from the production side, he would get opportunities that I wouldn't have gotten. So people would reach out to him and go, I've got this vocal if you want to do something with it. Or like, be like Christine Blonde, who did Love Shy. It's like we were talking to her about doing something, or we remixed like Alicia Dixon and, Taya Cruz and like, Sambuca, and all of these kind of things probably wouldn't have come to me if I'd been working on my own. But because I was working with him, I sort of got these opportunities, So it was good in that sense. And we put a couple of records out and things. And it was a good period for me in terms of like, just embedding myself even further into what was going on, and also using his studio equipment that he had there, being able to sample from his record collection, all that sort of stuff. He had loads of DATs of all the old remixes and things that they'd done. So basically, I said to him, "I'll record all the DATs for you and put them onto digital if you give, as long as I get a copy."
Amazing.
So I've got all these old like unreleased mixes of Tough Jam stuff and all the extra things that were on the DATs that never came out and all of that. So it's good. You get to have this peek behind the curtain, of a pioneer basically of that genre.
Amazing. And then I thought what was also interesting was that even though this had been, it was obviously really good for your career and you can tell what you've learned a lot, but at one point you decided that you needed to go off and just be solo for a while.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, which is funny, which is ironic because Matt Jam's label's called Solo actually, because when he split from Matt, he started a label called Solo, but split from Carl, sorry. Yeah, so you're right. What happened is in 2010-ish time, I'd moved back to Brighton at this point. I'd moved back to Brighton a couple of years before that, and I'd started DJing in a commercial club at like 2007, maybe start of 2008-ish. And I was playing like kind of dance mixes. It was all still house and garage, mostly house, but it was like commercial mixes of whatever was popular. So it'd be like Freemasons mixes of things, Motto Blanco, all of those kind of guys, of like kind of top 40-ish stuff. And then as it got a bit later, you could play a bit more underground stuff, a bit more techie, a bit more tribal, because the place I played at was open till 5 a.m. or whatever every weekend. So I essentially negotiated it so that I could do 2 days work a week and maybe the odd bank holiday or the odd extra student night or whatever every week. And that would pay for me to have my whole week. So I was earning a full-time wage from just doing those 2 days. And at that time, I had a small studio back in Brighton. And, that doing those 2 days covered all my costs. So I was kind of compromising a bit, but it was for the greater good as I saw it. And at that same time, I decided, as I'm back in Brighton now and traveling up to Matt's is becoming a bit more laborious, and there wasn't really much benefit to it because, as I said a moment ago, Matt's so well established that even if the person that's the bigger artist doesn't really intend to, they end up getting all of the acclaim. And it was me that was really making all of the music. So I was like, I should really just kind of amicably say, I'm going to do my own thing. We'll still work together on certain projects here and there, and we'll still do whatever, but I'm going to do my own thing. And so what I did is I started a new label of mine, and I started making this kind of jack in house sound, kind of like a bit more kind of disco-y, a bit more kind of West Coast sort of stuff. And it was popular and, you know, pretty popular on Traxsource at the time. And that was just a sound I liked. I thought it was fun. But again, I didn't, little did I know that I was going from one niche thing into another really, really niche thing. Except this niche thing wasn't even that popular in England. So it wasn't even like there was lots of gigs and producers and people that were doing it in the UK. There wasn't like a healthy club ecosystem and
Yeah.
managers and agents for this stuff. It was just like a few people kind of, and it was all a bit, you know, don't get me wrong, I love the guys I met, but it was all just, it was a bit like, I met loads of them at WMC. I went to WMC in Miami in 2012, and we had this kind of sort of almost this, you know, meeting or get together, and it was all a bunch of the people that were all kind of like selling those kind of records on
DJ
Stompy
Mez,
and
people like that.
yeah, it was like Mez, and it was like Corduroy Mavericks, and it was like you know, not Illinites weren't there, but obviously they were part of it. But it was that sound anyway. But it was all just a bit. It was all just a bit ramshackle and a bit like I just went away from that just thinking, there's no like, this is not really a career. Do you know what I mean? And I actually had a conversation with Sonny Fodera at that WMC, and I said to him, because me and him were like the top of the tree at making that sound at the moment. He was bigger than I was, but me and him were like consistently like
Yeah.
1 and 2 in terms of like in the
The
charts.
Jack and House chart.
But yeah, he was releasing on Guest House and some bigger labels and Sorted and stuff. Whereas I was mainly doing my own label. But
Yeah.
he had a conversation with me and we were talking about it, and he was saying, you know, there's a glass ceiling to this sound, Scott. If you want to grow beyond this, you're going to have to change, which is exactly what he did with Defected. Defected sort of came along and just went, we love what you do, Sonny, but you're going to need to tweak it a little bit.
Yeah.
And then start doing that, you know, and take what you do sort of on a fundamental, but just adapt it a little bit for what Defected needs for it to be a bit more global. And then obviously he's gone off and done
But again,
amazing.
A great sort of learning ground, because you get to see what's popular. Like, even though it's a small chart, the Jack and House chart is selling less than, and Traxsource is a smaller store than Beatport in terms of volume that they sell, you still have a number one. So one record is more popular with those DJs than the others, and you get to find out, okay, that really works, that really works, that really works.
Yeah.
And we spoke about this in the sort of chats before today, that learning that about structure, learning that stuff about, you know, how to make records is super important.
Yeah, I think as well there's an argument to say that it's good in terms of it's a good thing in terms of maybe motivation and stuff as well. What I mean by that is if you're in these kind of smaller worlds to start with, and you're able to make some headway, even though at the time you may not know that you're making headway in a much smaller, you may know it's a smaller pond, but you may not know how small.
Yeah.
You know, but even in spite of that, it's probably good for your motivation and continued sanity to want to continue making music and sort of to continue pursuing it, because you can see yourself with some level of realizing some level of recognition.
Yeah,
because you are getting featured on the websites, and you're getting support, and you're getting in DJ charts, and you're getting a number one, you know, and you're actually seeing, okay, there is something that can happen here. And if you were just if you were just like, I'm just going to make this sound that's huge, it's probably going to take you a long time to really move the needle. And whether you've got the motivation, the resources, and everything else that's required to kind of keep that going, you know, that may not be the case. So I definitely think that there's something to be said for that as well.
Yeah, so interesting that's the point where you sort of had those conversations about reaching a glass ceiling. So now I'd like to talk about, because you know, you're not just a producer and a DJ, you've got a sample pack label, you're a sound designer, you're involved with, you know, VST instruments, plugins, the whole thing. So can you talk a little bit about that versatility, and did that come out of that like realization that you had to maybe you had to try some different things, or there was a ceiling, or what inspired you to do that?
I think the initial thing for me was back in 2010 when I kind of switched to working on my own, and then started the new label, and around that period of time, I had a couple of the studio I was actually using. There was a complex of like 4 or 5 rooms there, and downstairs there was a flyer company called Don't Panic, which was quite a famous flyer company at the time, and obviously involved in music and whatever. and there was a guy there that was a musician that I was talking to, and he was saying that he'd been doing some like I think he played guitar or something, and he was saying he'd been doing some guitar sessions for this Brighton based sample label, which was Loop Masters. And then upstairs, I'd taken over the room that Brocky and Friction had previously had. And then in the other room, there was a guy called Will, who I'm really good friends with to this day. He's called High Ranking, producer
Right,
of High
okay,
Ranking,
yeah.
and he was making dubstep at the time. And he had started a sample label called Rankin Audio, and he basically was looking for people to help him. And because I was basically in the complex, he was like, "Hey, do you want to help me make this pack?" I was like, "What's the pack?" And he was like, "Moon Baton." And I was like, "It was this brand." I don't know if you remember that, around like 2010, 11ish. And I was like, "What the hell is Moon Baton?" Like, so. But he was like, "Oh, it's basically just this kind of like reggaeton beat, but with like really heavy bass and everything." I was like, "Okay, look, play me some stuff or whatever." And so he started playing me a few of these tracks, and I was like, "Okay." And I kind of found it interesting, I think, because it allowed you to sort of almost like you have to like dissect the DNA of a record.
Yeah.
And I'm quite nerdy about that sort of stuff. It's like what makes this record like, it's sort of this era rather than this. What are the identifying characteristics of? It's like kind of PhD musicology level type stuff, right? Where it's like, well, what is it about this particular record? Is it tempo? Is it like is it instruments used? Is it like recording techniques? Is that processing? Whatever. There's all these kind of things that you can use to sort of help characterize a piece of music and where it sort of belongs, right?
Yeah.
And so in doing that, also you then have to. So when you're going to make a sample pack, you almost also have to reverse engineer.
Yeah.
And sort of look at, well, what were they using to make that music at that time? If you're trying to recreate that effect, how do you best go about that? Whether it's like effects or it's a certain sampler or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I quite enjoyed that aspect of kind of like deconstructing it and learning how to make this thing that you'd sort of never made before.
Yeah.
Doing it from almost like a sort of a really analytical perspective. And then it also, I think that it sort of broadens your musical chops,
Yeah, it definitely teaches you.
It means you become good at like more disciplines. It's like being able to cook more than one type of cuisine well, or something of that nature. So I really liked doing that. And then so once I'd done this sort of initial Moon Baton pack thing for him, he was like, well, you're doing this. I was actually, funny enough, at the time I was sort of making, it's so mad now, it's just like, because this amount of styles of music I made is ridiculous, but I was kind of actually I was sort of making a bit of dubstep at the time, but I wasn't making I wasn't making like heavy dubstep. I was making kind of like emotional dubstep, which I called love step, as like kind of a joke. But it was kind of like soulful. It was kind of like garage, soulful garage stuff, but with kind of a dubstep drum beat. Yeah. And actually, the funny thing is, he was managed by a company called Underdog Management, who are doing all of this.
Yeah.
We even did a record with like where we did a video in Dave Courtney's like sex dungeon and stuff like that. It was mad. I almost forgot about this whole like time, but I was still doing the house stuff, but I was also doing this thing on the side. It was called Evolve or Die. It was like kind of this like dubsteppy project, But and funny enough, I ended up kind of getting a management offer from his management company as well, but to do kind of the opposite of what he was doing, because he was doing this like very kind of like heavy sort of dubstep, what would go on to become like bro step sort of thing,
Yeah.
But he was kind of doing this heavy UK dubstep, and he was touring all over, doing America and everything. But I wanted to do more like hybrid live, kind of love step, chill dubstep, but with chords and music and have vocalists and stuff. And they loved the idea. I went up and pitched it to them and like played a couple of things to them, and they were like, "Yeah, we love it," and all this. But nothing really ended up happening with it. But anyway, so yeah, I was kind of doing all that sort of stuff, and so I was kind of making all these packs, and then I kind of got in with Loop Masters, basically, who are kind of Brighton based.
Yeah.
And I just got on really well with the guy Matt Pelling, who owned it. It's been sold to Beatport now, and then I just ended up doing loads of stuff, and I kind of was on this crest of a wave where, like, when the deep house and garage thing was happening with Dusky and all of that, I basically was making packs that were in that style, and they were selling like hotcakes.
Right,
because
okay.
everyone wanted to make that style. And so a lot of the stuff I've done for Loop Masters over the years were like some of the biggest selling packs they ever did. And so I kind of found that I was pretty good at it because I kind of understood.
Sorry to interrupt, but tell us some of the artists that you know that have used your packs, because I think that's going to be fascinating for people.
Well, the stuff from years ago, I can't even remember. But the new stuff that I've been doing, the nightlife audio stuff, it's like, I mean, if you go, do you know the Corrupt FM record, Your Mum Loves Garage?
Yeah.
There's my samples all over that. Rudimental, KSI and Anne Marie, Mike Skinner from the Streets, like Broader, Digital Farm Animals, like all these guys are all using like all my drums and stuff.
Brilliant.
And there's that track by Different, that Ministry of Sound just signed.
Yeah,
It's got that vocal in it. Who's ready for the rinse out? That's my vocal. Yeah, so I used to all the MC vocals and stuff on there as well. So they've been used a lot as well in tracks. And but so I've found that I've kind of had an affinity for it. I think because my standards are high musically, and I kind of I always only really put stuff in there that I'd actually want to use. And I think years ago, the sample making industry kind of started to get a bit of a bad rap because people were selling stuff by content amount. So it would be like there's a gigabyte of samples and you're paying for a gigabyte of samples, but what you're actually paying for is about 150 megabytes of really good samples, and the rest is just filler. And we're kind of doubling up the loops when we don't need to make them biggest file size, but you're not actually offering any extra value and all that sort of stuff.
Here's a loop minus the kick. Here's a loop minus the hat.
Yeah.
Here's a loop minus,
and that's fine. 10. That's fine to do, but if you're selling it on size, just sell the pack. Because you're selling the pack, and then you get all these variations in there which are useful. Don't say to someone we're selling you a gigabyte of data and you're paying for a gigabyte of data, and then you're just fleshing it out and you're leaving loads of space at the end of one shots, because all that sort of stuff is really it's really poor. It's really amateur, and so because I was never really interested in doing stuff like that, I think that's why my samples have stood the test of time, and why I've done well out of it. But there was a while where people were just trying to cash in because they're like, oh, there's money to be made here, and you could get paid quite nice advances and stuff from Loop Masters and Splice and all these companies. But ultimately, I've still got sounds that are being used years and years and years later. I'm still making money out of products that I made 7 or 8 years ago, and I'm still getting royalty checks every 3 months for those. But that's only happening because I made them of a certain quality at the time, and I'm committed to doing that. If I just, churned it out and, as they say, and phoned it in, that wouldn't be happening. And it's the same approach I try and take with music. It's like if I want something that's going to stand the test of time, that means getting played in 5 years' time by someone and you're still getting that enjoyment out of it. So that's how I kind of got into doing the sample thing, I think. And as well, I think I just realised it's about, you've got to diversify, and that's become more important now than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about that, there's a couple of things, we're getting towards the end. So there's a couple of things I definitely wanted to talk about. And one of the things I found most surprising was you've never had a manager or an agent.
No.
So tell us but you have released on labels that people would call bucket list labels, like Defected, and you played their festival, which a lot of house DJs would call a bucket list thing to do. So tell us a little bit about that, and then you can tell us about the Fred Again, Boiler Room, and Haribo. So let's start with Defected.
Tell you about what the Defected connection, or how that happened.
Yeah. Just how you go about doing that when you don't have a manager, how you go about hustling in a modern way with and getting these and moving up into that.
It's an interesting one with Defected because I was living in America at the time. This was 2017, 2018. I was living in America at the time. I was living in Philadelphia. And I was making this kind of much more jazzy, deep house stuff, which is the Grand Plans label that I've got. And I was doing a bunch of remixes and things, and they were doing quite well, for the world that they were in. And I obviously got the attention of someone in the Defected office, Andy Daniel, I think, who's amazing A&R.
Yeah.
But also Melvo had not long started working there, and Melvo actually reached out to me and said, your name keeps getting mentioned around the office. I think maybe we should get together and have a beer or whatever. And I said to him, replied to him and said, well, I've already spoken to Simon and I'm coming in to see Simon. So unless you want to tread on Simon's toes, I suggest you he was like, yeah, just go and meet Simon. It's fine. So I went in and I met Simon, and I had a really lovely, really productive chat with him. And I said to him, I want to make vocal records and stuff like that. But Sonny Fodera, I think, had not long left Defected.
Right, okay.
I think he felt that he'd outgrown them, and that he now was kind of able to he essentially, I think, reached a point where he didn't really need Defected. He could sell out Brixton Academy by himself, and kind of put that part on himself, and whatever. And I'm not saying that Defected were looking for the next Sonny Fodera, but they were certainly looking for someone that was going to put out vocal kind of tunes. And I was like, I want to put out vocal tunes, but I don't really want to make that, that straight up commercial style. And I think what had gotten their attention was the stuff I was already doing. And so to me, it was like, I've gotten your attention by the stuff that I'm doing. So doesn't make any sense for me to now start making something different. Now I've got your attention. Now my foot's in the door. I had
If only A&Rs thought like that. If only.
yeah, I had this conversation, and the thing is, I had a conversation with him talking about vocals, and maybe reworking some of their catalog or working with singers, because they obviously got a publishing arm as well.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, maybe you can hook me up with some singers, and we can kind of do some stuff together, and that's a great cross pollination to get the two things going. And he was all up for that, and he was great, and he was really gracious with me, and it was brilliant. And then I think I got sent a Sunny Federa remix to do. They were going to do To Love for that thing with Shannon Saunders.
Yeah.
So he wanted me to do a mix of that, and then I started doing. Then he was kind of then it took him like a year to reply, and then he wanted me to go back to it, and I was just like. But I think what happened with Defected was I played at the festival. I did a couple of dates in Ibiza for them, but I never really felt like I really fitted in there. You know, that's not necessarily their fault, but I just think that just the conversations I had, you know, with them, looking back on it now, I don't know. I never really saw myself as being a defected artist, so I don't know what the use would have been of me doing it. Maybe, but they've got so many labels that if they had said to me, we see you being more someone that's aligned with Sulfuric or that's aligned with Classic Music Company, where I maybe could have seen myself fitting in a bit better.
Yeah.
I could have made it would have made more sense to me, but that conversation never happened. It was just like, you know, we like what you're doing, and that's that. And then it kind of petered out. And I know Wes really, really well now, who's now owns it. And I actually knew Wes before I knew any of the guys that Defected, through working with Simmer Black and Low Stepper and all of that. I was releasing on there and doing some of the best, you know, some of the sort of best-selling releases on that label. And so I think there was a combination of that going on. But so that's kind of how it came about. But I did the festivals and stuff, and you know, I put a remix out with them that year. And I've just done a remix this year, actually, My Desire, which went to #1 on Traxsource.
Yeah.
It's a remix of an old Next Phase thing, but that was Seamus that got me involved in that. Seamus Haji. So you know, there's the door's always open, I think, for these kind of things. But for me, it has to make sense in terms of what I'm doing, and the fact that I'm doing the housey garagey thing now works well for them. So maybe I'll end up doing a couple more things for them, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, it was more just how it happened, but the reality of how it happened was you were just really good at what you did, and they were sort of, it was just good A&R on them. Just they're like, this we really enjoy this music. Let's get them in for a chat.
I guess I guess that's the thing. Just, you know, just doing what you love doing, and then hoping the opportunity comes to you by virtue of there being some sort of connection musically with the people that are enjoying what you're doing. And to the thing you say about management and an agent, you know, my understanding of it is that when someone wants to manage you or wants to look after you, you know, for gigs and stuff, they will let you know. It's like this idea of like you asking them to look after you is a bit like, well, no, if they wanted to, you know, they would ask you.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, obviously there's some people that kind of slip through the net, you know. I've had someone say to me before, I think that people think you already have an agent, and that's why this, you know, that's why agents never say to you who's doing your bookings, because they make an assumption that someone is doing your bookings.
Yeah.
And so I think there's an element of that. I don't know how true that is, because even if that's true, they can still ask you the question. But yeah, I've you know, for me, the organic process of how things happen is really important. And if I was to force something and go, oh, this agency here, maybe I should try my best to get on that agency, then I then have to kind of maybe compromise for that to happen. Maybe then I have to do some things that I don't really necessarily want to do, because they're like, well, this will help you get more bookings, and you did ask to be on this agency, etc., etc. Whereas if someone comes to you and they already really know what you're about and it's a really natural fit, then you can just go, we get
they're
each
more
other.
keen to work with you.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. And they actually like your principles. They like the way you do things, and that's part of the reason why they're asking you. So the chances are less that they'll ask you to deviate from that a great deal.
Absolutely. And then the other thing which I was really curious about was just how it must have felt when, you know, tell us a bit about Haribo, how it came about, because that happened after you got back together with Matt.
Yeah. So
and then Fred again playing it on his boiler room, and how that sort of impacted, because a lot of people would be like, oh my God, that must have changed your life, but maybe not.
No, I mean, so the thing with that, the first thing to say about that is it wasn't under my name, it was under Echelon, which I kind of set up as an alias, because the idea, when I first started working with Matt again, the idea was that I was going to do some kind of more darker, kind of more moodier, you know, esoteric stuff under that name, and it wouldn't have made sense to do it as Scott Diaz. And so that was initially the thing. I started working with Matt again in 2020, just like during COVID and stuff. And we put out just a bunch of music, in 2020, 2021, just a bunch of garage EPs.
You've got that label, have you?
Underground Freaks, yeah, which is a label we set up together, and we did a few parties off the back of it and stuff like that. And so we were just doing this garage thing, and we were kind of like, the idea, we started off with this thing called New Heroes. So the idea was that me and him would work with new producers and give them a platform. So we did a track with Smokey Bubble and B, who's doing loads now. We did a track with we did a track with Shosh from 24 Hour Garage Girls, who's like massive now. We had who else did we have? I can't remember. We had Aki from Four, the guys down in Southampton. And so we had Selector on the next one and a few people like that. And then we were also just kind of doing our own bits and pieces in between. And we just did this track Haribo, and literally it's just called Haribo because there was a pack of Haribo in the studio and we needed a name for it. And there's actually a picture of me like holding some Haribo, pointing at it, it's stupid, but we called it that, and then we put it out, and then it just did whatever it did, and that was it. Just move on to the next thing. And then about 2 years later, I get this thing from Smokey, and he's like, check this boiler room out. and basically now that boiler room's on like 50 million views or something insane. And actually most of the music he played in that boiler room is his own music.
Yeah.
So he only played about 3 or 4 tracks that aren't his.
Else.
Yeah, and one of them's that track.
Amazing.
And he's put a Heady One vocal over the top. He put like an acapella over it.
Yeah.
But the thing is, we didn't actually send it to him because I had no way of getting music to him. So he obviously bought it somewhere. And then he also played it at Madison Square Garden as well.
Wow.
Because when he did that show with Skrillex and Fortet, he played it there, and I've got video of that as well.
Amazing.
And then I think he played it somewhere else. He put it on that boiler room went onto Apple Music, and so they've got the mix up there as well. And so yeah, it's you notice a spike in sales a little bit. You'd have people going to the Bandcamp and buying it and stuff. As soon as I started identifying what it was, because people was in the comments on YouTube are like, oh, this is Fred Again's track, and I'd be like, it's not Fred Again's track, I'd put a link to it, whatever. So you try and do things like that to kind of like ride the.
But interesting that you have to do that.
But he's never reached out to me and gone, have you got any more music or anything like that, or I'll send you the parts if you want, and you can do what you want with it, and because there's little bits of vocal in there, maybe you'd want to take them off so you can do your own true version, but that's never that hasn't happened, so yeah, it's still great that for it to get played, but it just goes to show you, man, like you can just put something out and it's just the record is the same record. It's the same record before and after Fred Again playing it. It's the same tune. But the fact that someone's played it gives it this credence and gives it this moment that's like, oh, now all of a sudden it's important. Like all of a sudden now it's something we should care about. And it's great that can happen, but it's also sad in a way because, that it shouldn't have to take that for someone to go, well, I appreciate this tune and and I'm interested and I want to know what this stuff is without it having to be kind of blown up, because then it's almost like it's being attached to this idea of their status or it being a fashionable moment or whatever. And I guess that's sort of the world we're living in more and more now.
There's not many people with that courage of their conviction to go, I'm just going to say I like it, and I'm not going to care what anyone else thinks. And oh, great, if Fred Again's playing it, great, but I just always liked it.
Yeah, it's like the same record. Something is the same record as it always was, except now when someone puts it on their essential mix on Radio 1, now all of a sudden, oh, okay, it's a cool tune now. And so, and I guess that's the cynical thing. I don't really like to get involved in that. It's like for me, it's like if I'm going to play a record, I want to play it. I want to play it for a year. If I can't play something for 6 months to a year, it sort of doesn't even go in my record box. Because that to me is what DJing was.
That's a good show.
It's like you should want to be able to. If you came to see me every gig I played for a year, you'd probably hear me play a lot of mostly the same tunes. With a few different ones tacked on here and there, obviously. But that for me is what you should want to get behind. It's not this idea of just playing new music for the sake of playing new music. It's like I don't understand why, because there's so much stuff that's great that doesn't get the play it deserves, whether that's kind of newish stuff or stuff from the late 90s. I mean, there's still stuff from the late 90s I haven't even heard yet, that I'm excited about finding.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I mean, unfortunately, that's us come to the end. So I'd like to end the podcast with 2 questions that I ask everyone who's on here. So the first one is, you get the opportunity to go back in time. You get the chance to go back and meet the young Scott Diaz at that record shop where he's just about to start DJing. What's the one piece of advice you'd give him?
I'd probably give him 2. I'd say start learning piano earlier and don't sell any of your music equipment. Keep it. because it'll be worth money again in a few years after you sell it for dirt cheap, and then you'll have to buy it all back again for more money.
This is
That's
very
probably
true.
what I'd say.
This is very true. As someone who's sold a lot of Roland expensive analog gear, now it would cost me like thousands of pounds to buy back, but you just have to take that one on the chin. Great. And then the last one is you've decided, and it seems an unreasonable choice given your passion for the music, that you're going to give up DJing. But anyway, that's the scenario. You're giving up DJing and it's your last gig. The club's full and security have said you got one more tune. What is it?
Well, it'd probably have to be Gabrielle. Or MJ Cole Sincere.
I mean, both excellent choices, but I think we have to go with your version of Gabrielle. And everyone should go onto the internet and have a look, and you'll see. You definitely find it on Instagram, and Enzo Circus were playing it. You could go and check it out. It's sounding incredible. I hope you get it. I hope you get it licensed.
Me too.
Or I hope the legalities all get sorted.
I'm talking to the labels. So that's fingers crossed, but it's a long process, as you well know.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you very much, Scott Diaz.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
Cheers, man.
Cheers.